The first bite of winter had come early to the high country, a predator stalking the ridges and valleys with a blanket of silent, suffocating snow. For Elias Thorne, it was a welcome siege. For 10 years, solitude had been his only trusted companion, the mountain his fortress, the cabin he'd built with his own hands his final redoubt against a world that had taken everything. Each morning, he would stand on his porch, the steam of his coffee a fleeting ghost in the frigid air, and watch the sun crest the jagged peaks. It was a ritual of remembrance, a quiet vigil for the two smiling faces that lived only in the weathered photograph on his mantelpiece and in the hollowed-out chambers of his heart. His wife, Sarah. His daughter, Lily. Gone. The word itself was a chasm, and he had spent a decade walking its edge. His life was a metronome of survival, chopping wood, checking traps, carving intricate wooden birds that he never sold. They were effigies of a freedom he no longer felt, each feather a stroke of penance. But on this day, the rhythm broke. A shape, a dark smudge against the blinding white expanse at the edge of his property, snagged his eye. It was wrong. Nothing moved in this cold except the wind and the hardiest of creatures. Curiosity, an emotion he thought long dead, pricked at him. He pulled on his heavy coat, his boots crunching a samba beat in the fresh powder, and walked toward the anomaly. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a human form. A girl, huddled and still, wrapped in a blanket so thin it was an insult to the cold. He knelt, his gloved fingers brushing the snow from her face. She was young, a teenager perhaps, her skin a pale, marbled blue, her lips tinged with a frightening violet. A crude splint, little more than 2 branches and a torn piece of cloth, was tied around her leg. He pressed his fingers to her neck. A pulse. Faint, thready, but there. It was a flicker of life in a world of white death. 100 rational thoughts told him to go back inside, to call the sheriff in the distant town, to let the authorities handle it. This was not his fight. He had retired from the world of other people's pain. But then her eyelids fluttered, a barely perceptible movement. And in that sliver of a moment, in the delicate curve of her cheekbone and the scatter of freckles across her nose, he saw the ghost of his Lily. The chasm at his feet suddenly opened wide, and on the other side was this child, this stranger. To leave her would be to lose his daughter all over again. With a groan that was part physical effort and part soul-deep ache, Elias scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a memory, a fragile burden against his chest. As he turned back toward the warmth of his cabin, the wind howled like a gathering of wolves, and the sky, heavy with more snow, seemed to press down, as if to seal them in, to make this choice, this terrifying act of intervention, an irrevocable pact. He had just invited the world, with all its darkness and danger, back across his threshold. The door to his sanctuary was now open, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that whatever left this girl to die in the snow would eventually come looking for her. The fortress was breached. The siege had begun. For 3 days, the girl, Lena, drifted on a feverish tide between delirium and a deep, unevaded sleep. Elias moved with a quiet, forgotten efficiency, his large hands, usually occupied with the precise work of carving knives, now gentle as they bathed her brow, spooned broth between her cracked lips, and checked the makeshift splint on her leg. The cabin, once a silent mausoleum of memory, was filled with new sounds, the soft whisper of Lena's breathing, the crackle of the fire Elias kept roaring in the hearth, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as he paced. He felt like a ghost himself, haunting the edges of her recovery. When she finally woke, her eyes, a startling clear blue, were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. She tried to sit up, a strangled cry catching in her throat, and then her gaze fell upon her own legs, still and unresponsive beneath the thick woolen blanket. I can't feel them," she whispered, the words fractured by panic. Elias pulled a chair closer to the cot he'd set up for her near the fire, his presence a solid, calming weight in the turbulent room. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You were out in the cold for a long time. Your leg was injured. We need to give it time," but he knew, from the unnatural stillness of her lower body, that it was more than the cold. He had seen injuries like this before, in another life. The finality in her stillness spoke of something severed, something broken beyond the mending of bone. Over the next week, a fragile routine formed. He would help her through agonizingly gentle exercises, moving her legs for her, fighting against the atrophy he knew was setting in. He was patient, methodical, his face an unreadable mask, but inside, a fierce, protective instinct was roaring to life. He was no longer just a grieving widower, he was a guardian. Lena, in turn, began to thaw, not just physically, but emotionally. She spoke in hesitant fragments, painting a blurry picture of a car ride, a sudden, violent swerve, and waking up in the snow with a man's voice promising he'd be back for her. He never came. She never spoke his name. The story was a sieve, full of holes he didn't dare to press. He found a small, silver locket clasped around her neck. When he tried to ask her about it, a wall of fear went up, her eyes clouding over, and she would fall silent for hours. He let it be. He learned to read her moods, to see the spark of a fierce intellect behind her fearful eyes, to hear the ghost of a laugh when his clumsy attempts at cooking resulted in a burnt pancake. He was saving her body, but she, in her own quiet way, was saving his soul. One afternoon, as he was helping her sit up, a glint of light from the valley below caught his eye. A vehicle. Not the battered pickup of a local hunter, but a sleek, black sedan, utterly alien to this rugged landscape. It moved slowly along the winding dirt road that led toward his property, a shark cruising in unfamiliar waters. It stopped for a long moment, a dark sentinel watching from afar, before turning and retreating the way it came. A cold dread, separate from the mountain chill, settled in Elias's gut. He knew it wasn't a lost tourist. It was a scout. A harbinger. He now had a choice, a clear and terrible one. He could pack her into his truck, drive her to the sheriff in town, and relinquish responsibility. He could hand her over to the system, wash his hands of the danger, and retreat back into the safety of his grief. Or he could keep her, this broken girl with a hidden past, and stand against the coming storm. What would you do in this situation? Would you choose the quiet safety of the life you know, or the dangerous uncertainty of protecting a life you don't? Tell us in the comments. For Elias, the choice was made the moment he looked back at Lena, who was watching him with trusting, hopeful eyes. He had already let one girl down. He would not fail another. The black sedan became a recurring omen, a phantom on the periphery of their isolated world. It never came close enough to be a direct threat, but its presence was a constant, psychological pressure, a reminder that the sanctuary Elias had built was no longer invisible. He began to fortify the cabin, not with obvious barricades, but with the quiet cunning of a man who knew his land. He set up subtle tripwires made of twine and small bells in the woods, rechecked the deadbolts, and always kept his father's old hunting rifle clean and close at hand. Lena saw the shift in him, the steel returning to his spine, the watchful intensity in his eyes. His quiet care was now matched by a fierce readiness, and it scared her as much as it comforted her. The day the shadow finally fell across their doorstep, the air was still and deceptively peaceful. A man, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat that seemed absurd in the wilderness, walked up the path to the cabin as if he owned it. He moved with an easy, predatory grace, his polished shoes leaving clean, deep prints in the snow. Elias met him on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. He recognized the man instantly, and the recognition was a punch to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. It was his brother, Marcus Thorne. They had not spoken in 10 years, not since the day Marcus had stood at the graves of Sarah and Lily, offering hollow condolences and a check that Elias had torn in two. Marcus smiled, a cold, thin slash in his handsome face. "Little brother," he said, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "A man could get lost out here." "It's good to see you're still rusticating." Elias's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "What do you want, Marcus?" Marcus's eyes flickered past Elias, trying to pierce the gloom of the cabin's interior. "Business, of a sort. I'm looking for someone. A ward of a charitable foundation I oversee. A troubled young woman, prone to flights of fancy. She ran away. We tracked her phone to this area before it died. Her name is Lena." He described her perfectly, from her blue eyes to the silver locket she always wore. He painted her as unstable, a liability. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. He kept his face a granite mask. Haven't seen anyone. It's been a long winter. Marcus's smile tightened. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Elias, let's not play games. We both know you have a soft spot for strays. I'm sure she spun you some tragic tale. But she's a danger to herself. I'm her legal guardian. I just want to get her the help she needs. The lie was so slick, so practiced, it was almost believable. But Elias could see the flicker of something else in his brother's eyes, a cold, possessive greed. There's no one here, Elias repeated, his voice like the grinding of stones. Marcus held his gaze for a long moment, then shrugged, a gesture of feigned nonchalance. All right. Have it your way. He turned to leave, then paused. You know, some things are better left buried, little brother. Whether it's in the snow, or in the past, the veiled threat hung in the air long after the black sedan had disappeared down the road. Inside, Lena was pale, trembling. She had overheard everything from her cot. The sound of Marcus's voice had broken through her wall of fear. Tears streamed down her face as the story she'd held back finally came pouring out. Marcus was her guardian, yes, appointed after her parents died in a plane crash. He was also the trustee of her significant inheritance. The accident wasn't an accident at all. She had found paperwork, proof that Marcus was systematically embezzling her entire fortune. When she confronted him, he'd smiled that same cold smile, promised to take her for a drive to talk it over, and had deliberately driven the car off an embankment, confident the remote location and the coming storm would finish the job. He had left her broken and paralyzed, whispering that he'd be back, a final, cruel piece of psychological torture. The man who was supposed to protect her had tried to murder her. And now, Elias understood. This wasn't just about a runaway girl. It was about his brother, the embodiment of the soulless, corrupt world he'd fled, bringing his darkness to the one place Elias had left to call sacred. The sky, as if sensing the coming confrontation, turned a bruised, slate gray. A blizzard, the likes of which hadn't been seen in years, descended upon the mountain, a furious, white-out squall that severed them completely from the outside world. The wind screamed, rattling the window panes and clawing at the cabin's sturdy log walls. Inside, the fire roared, a defiant beacon of warmth against the elemental rage. It was in the heart of this storm that Marcus returned. This time, he was not alone. Two large, grim-faced men flanked him, their forms barely visible through the swirling snow. They were not dressed for the weather, they were dressed for a purpose. Elias had been waiting. The hunting rifle was heavy and solid in his hands. Lena, propped up against the wall on her cot, clutched the small smartphone Elias had managed to charge with a hand-crank generator. Her face was a mask of terror, but her eyes held a new, steely resolve. Elias, you don't have to do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. He'll kill you. He looked at her, and for a moment, she wasn't just Lena. She was Lily. She was every innocent thing the world tried to crush. He's not getting in, Elias said, his voice a low growl of absolute certainty. The first heavy thud against the door was like a declaration of war. Elias! Marcus's voice was distorted by the wind, a venomous shriek. Open the door. You can't protect her. Give me the girl and I'll walk away. This doesn't have to get messy. Elias remained silent, his eyes fixed on the straining wood of the door. The thuds became heavier, the splintering of wood a sharp counterpoint to the howling wind. One of the men took a small axe to the door hinges. Inside, Lena, her fingers shaking, navigated to her phone's video recorder and pressed the red button, aiming the lens toward the door. The sound of the axe, the shouting, the terror, it was all being captured. You were always so self-righteous. Marcus roared, his frustration boiling over into a torrent of long-buried resentment. Hiding up here in your monument to failure. You think you're better than me? You're just a coward who ran away. The door hinge finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. A large hand reached through the gap, fumbling for the inside lock. Elias swung the butt of his rifle, connecting with a sickening crunch of bone. A scream of pain was swallowed by the storm. This momentary victory only enraged Marcus further. "You want to talk about failure, Elias? Let's talk about Sarah and Lily. Let's talk about that night." Lena's eyes shot to Elias. She saw a flicker of raw, unadulterated pain cross his face. "You spent 10 years blaming a phantom, a ghost in a stolen car." Marcus bellowed, his voice raw with a terrible, triumphant cruelty. "There was no ghost, little brother. It was me. I was driving that car. I was drunk, fleeing a deal gone bad, and your perfect little family got in my way. I buried it. I paid people off, and I buried it just like I'm going to bury you and that little thief you're protecting." The world stopped. The screaming wind, the cracking wood, the roaring fire, it all faded into a dull hum in Elias's ears. The mystery that had haunted his every waking moment, the cold case that had hollowed out his soul, was solved in a blast of vile, boastful hatred from the other side of his own door. A profound, terrifying calm settled over him. This was no longer just about protecting Lena. This was about standing on the grave of his past and facing the monster who had put his family there. With a roar that came from the depths of his being, he kicked the weakened door outward, exploding onto the porch and into the storm, straight at his brother. The fight was a blur of desperate, primal fury against the backdrop of the blizzard, a struggle not for vengeance, but for a final, terrible justice. As Elias disarmed one man and fought the other to a standstill, the distant, unmistakable sound of sirens began to cut through the howl of the wind. Lena, with a trembling finger, had found a flicker of a signal. Help was coming. The fight was over. Marcus stood, defeated and exposed, the truth of his monstrous nature laid bare in the heart of the storm he had created. The years that followed the storm were not years of forgetting, but of rebuilding. Marcus Thorne, his confession captured with perfect, damning clarity on Lena's phone, was tried and convicted for a litany of crimes, the most significant of which was the 10-year-old vehicular manslaughter of Sarah and Lily Thorne. The wealth he had used as a shield became the anchor that dragged him down, his empire crumbling under the weight of his revealed sins. Justice, it turned out, was not a ghost, it was just patient. For Lena, the road was longer. With her inheritance finally secured, she had access to the world's best medical and therapeutic care. Countless hours of grueling physical therapy confirmed the doctor's initial diagnosis: the damage to her spine was permanent. She would never walk again. But while her legs remained still, her spirit soared. The frightened girl who had huddled in the snow transformed into a woman of formidable strength. Supported by Elias, who was no longer just a protector but a father in every way that mattered, she finished her education, went to law school, and became a fiery, relentless advocate for the rights of victims, using her own story as a catalyst for change. She fought for those who had been silenced by power, cheated by guardians, and left broken by a system that favored the wealthy. She had found her voice in the silent cabin on the mountain, and now she used it to roar. Elias sold the cabin. The memories were no longer ghosts that haunted him, but gentle whispers of a life he had loved and lost. He had made his peace. The fortress of solitude had served its purpose, it had kept his heart safe until it was ready to be given away again. He and Lena moved into a bright, accessible house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the desolate beauty of the high country replaced by the gentle hum of life, of community. Their home was not one of quiet survival, but of vibrant, shared existence. It was a testament to the fact that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build, the one you fight for. On the 5th anniversary of the day he found her in the snow, Lena wheeled herself over to where Elias sat reading by a sun-drenched window. She held out a small, velvet box. "For you," she said, her smile as bright as the room. He opened it. Inside was a silver locket, heavier and more ornate than the one she used to wear. He clicked it open. On one side, nestled under the polished glass, was the treasured photograph from his old mantelpiece, Sarah and Lily, smiling into eternity. On the other side was a new picture, one taken just last summer in their garden. It was of him and Lena, his arm around her wheelchair, both of them laughing, their faces tilted toward the sun. You gave me back my life, Elias, she said, her voice thick with an emotion that transcended simple gratitude. But more than that, you showed me what a heart is for. It's not just for beating. It's for holding the people you love, the past and the present, all at once. And my heart, it will hold you forever. He looked from the locket to her face, and saw not the broken child from the storm, but the incredible woman she had become, and the family he thought he had lost forever, reborn and gifted to him anew. In that single, quiet moment, the long winter of his grief finally, completely, thawed. The story of Elias and Lena is a powerful reminder that our deepest wounds can sometimes create the openings through which new light can enter. One man, sealed away by grief, made a single choice to help a stranger, and in doing so, found not only justice for his past but a future he never thought possible. Their journey shows us that family isn't merely about blood, it's about the unbreakable bonds forged in shared struggle, unwavering support, and unconditional love. It teaches us that even in the face of absolute despair, a single act of kindness can be the catalyst that rewrites an entire life story. We all face moments where we can either retreat into our own safe fortress or step out into the storm for someone else. What storms have you faced in your life, and who was the person who helped you through? Share your stories of the unexpected heroes and found families in your own life in the comments below. We believe everyone has a story worth telling, and we'd be honored to hear yours. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell, so you never miss these reminders of the strength and beauty of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.